Hey everybody, this is a piece titled From Wilhelm Marr to Mavi, Marmara, Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism as Forms of Anti-Jewish Action by Thorsten Fuchshuber. It's my best guess at the pronunciation of that. Before we begin, let's look up some of the people here. German Wikipedia says, Wilhelm Marr lived from 1819 to 1904 and was a German journalist. He was the first to propagate anarchism in the German-speaking world. Later, he advocated radical democratic positions. In 1879, he founded the first anti-Semitic political organization in the German Empire, the Anti-Semitic League. In doing so, he coined the new term, Antisemitism, for a racially rather than a religiously based hostility towards Jews. And the Mavi Marmara, Turkish for Blue Sea of Marmara, is a passenger ship that became known in May 2010 for its participation in the Ship to Gaza convoy. And Wikipedia says, in the Ship to Gaza incident on the 13th of May 2010, the Israeli Navy boarded 6 ships in international waters loaded with humanitarian aid for the Gaza Strip, with which various groups were trying to break the blockade of Gaza that Israel had imposed since 2007, following the violent takeover of power by the terrorist organization Hamas. In clashes with Israeli soldiers on the ship Mavi Marmara, 9 activists were killed and an unknown number of them and 7 Israeli soldiers were slightly injured. Back to the text. And let's look up Thorsten Fuchshuber. I've definitely listened to talks by him, but I'm not really finding like a good description of who he is. I know he wrote a book on the Frankfurt School's conception of rackets. Anyway, Wilhelm Marr, the German journalist who popularized the term anti-Semitism in the late 19th century, did so because he wanted to move away from Christian anti-Judaism and transform Judeophobia into a kind of modern political concept. He argued that anti-Semitism is based on rational arguments and proudly called himself an anti-Semite. Marr claimed that he had nothing against Jews as individuals, only against Judaism, which he saw as a destructive social concept. He developed his understanding of anti-Semitism at the dawn of the liberal era and was therefore forced to resort to seemingly rational arguments in order to avoid lawsuits and comply with accepted forms of public debate. Today, the term anti-Zionism fulfills a similar function. It serves as a socially accepted form of expression of anti-Semitic attitudes and for their rationalization and legitimization as political arguments. Again, these arguments are supposedly not directed against the Jews, but against the state of Israel. Now, however, they are based on a postmodern understanding of universalism rather than a concept of rationalism that is considered part of the colonialist legacy. In 1862, Marr wrote that, quote, Judaism must end if humanity is to begin, end quote, in his first anti-Semitic pamphlet, Der Judenspiegel. Let's see if there's anything for this. Yeah, nothing coming up. All right. In 1862, Marr wrote that, quote, Judaism must end if humanity is to begin, end quote. In the first anti-Semitic pamphlet, Der Judenspiegel. Today, some 150 years later, the French philosopher Alain Badiou informs us that contemporary universalism requires everyone to dissociate himself or herself from Israel and to denounce its identity as a Jewish state. I'm trying to get to, there's a footnote here. Come on, you son of a gun. Footnote. For more on Der Judenspiegel, see the article Das Judentum muss aufhören, wenn das Menschentum anfangen soll. Wilhelm Marr, Der Spiegel, published in Hamburg, 1862. From Alain Badiou, Circumstances. 3. Portée du mot juif, from 2008. Quote, it is obvious that today is equivalent to Paul's religious separation from established Judaism, to Spinoza's rationalist separation from the synagogue, or to Marx's political separation from the bourgeois integration of part of his native community, is the subjective separation from the state of Israel, not from its empirical existence, which is no more or less impure than any other state, but from its exclusive identitarian claim of being a, quote, Jewish state, and from the policy of drawing on unending privilege based on that claim, and remarkably by trampling on what serves as international law. A truly contemporary state and country are always cosmopolitan, perfectly indistinguishable in the configuration of their identity, end quote. Alain Badiou, 2008. Not only does Badiou deny the role of the Shoah in the foundation of the state of Israel, but also he is indifferent to the fact that only a Jewish state can reliably guarantee the safety and protection of Jews in Israel and all over the world in the face of anti-Semitism. As discussed toward the end of this chapter, Badiou's proposal on how to best fight anti-Semitism is indeed for the Jews to abandon their, quote, particularistic Jewish identity, a proposal well known from older anti-Semitic writings, such as Bruno Bauer's Die Judenfrage, bracket, the Jewish question, end bracket, 1843. End footnote. I argue that both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism must be understood as a means to rationalize hatred against Jews. Looking back at Marr reminds us that the term anti-Semitism was not coined as a result of any objective analysis of the specifics of Jew hatred in modernity. It was instead a catchword used as a propaganda tool to rally the like-minded around the flag, so to speak. Therefore, when discussing various historical forms of Jew hatred, one should look at these concepts not merely in terms of the changes to an anti-Jewish mindset or ideology, although that is also important. It must be kept in mind that Jew haters have always seen the practical necessity of restructuring their anti-Jewish strategy and actions in response to changing social realities. This practical necessity can be summarized in one question: how can we harm our enemy, the Jew, in the most striking and most destructive way, but also in a way that is the most acceptable to and convincing from the rest of society? This chapter discusses the anti-Semitic quest for effective forms of action against Jews by taking a brief look into the past as well as a more detailed look at the present. Marr sought to create an anti-Jewish strategy that accounted for the fact that the German Jews had attained legal emancipation. In the next section, I present Marr's concept of anti-Semitism. I later argue that anti-Zionism can be analyzed as an anti-Jewish strategy responding to the fact that Jewish emancipation led to a Jewish nation-state. I analyze anti-Zionism as a practical answer to this anti-Semitic quest for efficient anti-Jewish action. Wilhelm Marr's concept of anti-Semitism. Wilhelm Marr was probably among the first anti-Semitic authors who formulated a, quote, clearly post-emancipatory argument, end quote, with regard to the legal and political status of the Jews in Germany. Footnote: see Moshe Zimmerman's book, Wilhelm Marr, the Patriarch of Anti-Semitism, published in 1986. In his 1879 book, Der Sieg des Judentums über das Germanentum, The Victory of Judaism over German Identity and Culture. Marr stressed the need to oppose the Jewish people from a non-confessional perspective. Consider, too, for example, the philosopher historian Bruno Bauer in 1843. He was living at a time when Jews were still denied equal rights in Germany. Thus Bauer stressed the need to further bar their emancipation by referring to what he understood as the Jewish, quote, essence, which he still saw as largely defined by religion. Footnote, quote, the Jews, religion was his way of life forced him into eternal isolation. Why? Because they are his essence, ... The emancipation of the Jews in a thorough, successful, and reliable way will only be possible if they are not emancipated as Jews, that is, as beings that must forever remain foreign to Christians, but rather if they turn themselves into humans no longer separated from their fellow humans by any barriers, including barriers mistaken as essential. End footnote. Marr, writing when Jewish emancipation had finally been accomplished, regarded such arguments as simply, quote, nonsensical, unquote. Footnote, quote, the mere fact that one wanted to hold the Jews responsible for the crucifixion of Christ after a trial known to have been staged by the cowardly Roman authorities, who gave into the cries of a Jerusalemite mob, demonstrates how nonsensical the religious aspect of this hatred against the Jews, against the Jews, was, end quote. Marr. By emphasizing the religious aspect, Marr argued, the German people had been blinded to the real danger posed by Jewish emancipation. Quote, "It did not occur to anyone," end quote, he wrote, quote, "that the Jewish question was a socio-political one, ... Judaism's socio-political invasion of German society achieved legal status. A foreign domination that factually had already existed was legally recognized," end quote. Marr, Der Sieg des Judentums. Now that the legal and political emancipation of the Jews had been accomplished, Marr declared, they would further usurp power over the German state. He saw the law merely as an instrument in the Jews' hands that gave them power over the state, just as did Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, who 50 years later coined the slogan, quote, "The masters of the Lex subjugate the Rex," end quote. Carl Schmitt. Footnote. Quoted in Raphael Gross, Carl Schmitt und die Juden, eine deutsche Rechtslehre, erweiterte Ausgabe. Gross points out that this quote has to be seen against the charge of the quote allegedly, end quote, soulless, end quote, Jewish nation, end quote. I fucked that up. Gross points out that this quote has to be seen against the charge of the quote allegedly quote soilless, end quote, Jewish nation, end quote. Raphael Gross. That only exists in law, and that with this idea, Schmitt actualized a popular anti-Semitic tradition, suggesting that, quote, the Jews, end quote, strive for the rule of law instead of the rule of man. The rule of law instead of the rule of man, struggling against the king, quote, Rex, or the Führer, in order to subjugate him. As Shira Wolosky notes, identification of Jews in law is also at the core of Alain Badiou's anti-universalist universalism. Shira Wolosky's article, Badiou, Paul, and Anti-Judaism, Post-Identity and the Abuse of Ethics, published in Telos in 2016. Ironically enough, that journal Telos is which had a very serious right-wing turn, is very much guided by the work of Carl Schmitt in many cases. Where am I? End footnote. The Jew haters had lost the legal sphere as a tool to be used against the Jews, and now saw the law as having become the Jews' weapon in their struggle for dominance. Marr thus recognized the need for a new strategy against the Jews, namely a more general political attack against them. In his biography of Marr, Moshe Zimmerman writes in depth about the function of the term anti-Semitism and whether it was truly invented by Marr in 1879. Zimmerman concludes that the term anti-Semitism, compared to anti-Jewish, became popular in particular among writers and scholars because of its scientific pretensions. The term was also somewhat vague and thus, quote, good cover, end quote, against, quote, legal suits, end quote, casting, quote, a cloak of uncertainty over the intent of the hatred against the Jews, which people still avoided mentioning explicitly, end quote. As Zimmerman wrote in 1986, the term anti-Semitism served the same, quote, purpose which the term, quote, anti-Zionism serves today, evading the accusation of engaging in something improper, end quote. Well, it is worth considering, according to Richard S. Levy. Let me actually look up some of these people. Moshe Zimmerman. Moshe Zimmerman was born in 1943 and is an Israeli historian and writer. Moshe Zimmerman is a professor emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. From 1986 to 2012, he was the director of the Richard Kubner Minerva Center for German History. And the next person referenced is Richard S. Levy. Richard S. Levy lived from 1940 to 2021 and was a professor of modern German history at the University of Illinois at Chicago from 1971 until his retirement in 2019. He is most noted for his contributions to history and debunking several anti-Semitic myths, as well as uncovering many others. Levy was featured on a TV documentary concerning the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, A Deadly Deception, which aired on the History Channel on the 11th of May, 1999. Levy died of prostate cancer at his home on the 23rd of June, 2021, at the age of 81. Back to the text. While it is worth considering, according to Richard S. Levy, Zimmerman still misses the crucial point. In Levy's critical review of the Marr biography, Levy wrote that the, quote, designations, quote, anti-Semite and, quote, anti-Semitism gained immediate currency all over Europe, end quote, because they answered a, quote, need for new terms that better described a new and, necessary form of action against Jews. A new and necessary form of action against Jews. Marr had understood that once Jews gained legal emancipation, the old sorts of anti-Jewish behavior, were no longer adequate. Now it was too late for such defensive gestures. A continuous political effort would have to be mounted, institutionalized in parties, propaganda associations, and newspapers, end quote. Levy. This continuous political effort is exactly what Marr pursued. He founded a variety of anti-Semitic newspapers such as Deutsche Wacht, German Guard, and the Antisemitische Flugblätter, anti-Semitic leaflets. Arguing that anti-Semitism is based on rational arguments, he claimed that he had nothing against Jews as individuals. What he opposed was Judaism itself, which he considered a destructive concept. Although Marr had begun with proposals for measures such as assimilation, baptism, and mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews in 1862, by 1979 the forms of action he was proposing had become more radically exclusionary. As Zimmerman writes, they, quote, included a ban on business dealings with Jews, the severance of social relations with Jews, withdrawing support from the Jewish press and Jewish candidates, and the separation of Jewish from non-Jewish education. In short, quote, the isolation of Jewry within the state and society. End quote. Zimmerman. Clearly, after the legal sphere had been lost as a weapon against the Jews, Marr sought new ways to mobilize for the Jews' total exclusion from society, politically, socially, and economically, all in the name of a, quote, noble anti-Semitism. As Marr wrote, a, quote, bulwark, end quote, must be erected against the Semitic flood, since the educated person must certainly reject barbaric measures, end quote. Marr. Some 150 years after Marr, we know that the National Socialists used precisely this strategy of social exclusion before taking the next step toward their policy of extermination. Thus, what Marr had previously proposed was a new form of practice rather than a new anti-Jewish ideology. New section. Anti-Zionism as an anti-Jewish strategy. Insofar as Marr's concept of anti-Semitism was a response to Jewish emancipation, anti-Zionism is a response to the foundation of the State of Israel. Just as Marr was confronted with formal law as a social institution that protected Jews equally as citizens, Judeophobes today are confronted with the Jewish state as a social and political institution that protects Jews and not only in Israel. And just as Marr sought forms of action to undermine the social status of Jews as citizens, anti-Zionism attempts to find strategies to undermine the sovereignty of Israel. Below, I discuss some of these strategies and their implied forms of action. When we speak of the sovereignty of a nation-state, we can focus on its internal sovereignty and political constitution. We can discuss the relationship between the sovereign and the subjects protected and governed by the sovereign, or we can enter into the long-standing discussion on what sovereignty means externally, that is, the relationships between sovereign states. Footnote. In various analyses, the social critic Gerhard Scheidt has pointed out that international law is only meant to apply, but does not apply in an effective way because there is no sovereign body that guarantees the rule of international law. International law is a set of conventions that are based on arrangements between states, and as such it is not guaranteed by a superordinate power. See Gerhard Scheidt, Der Wahn vom Weltsouverän zur Kritik des Völkerrechts. Scheidt further explains that it is precisely Israel that is continually forced to lend credence to this. An anti-Semitic attack against its existence are not repelled by international law, but only by the sovereignty of the Jewish state as exercised by the Israel Defense Forces. End footnote. What makes Israel's sovereignty exceptional, among other factors, is that the question of its subjects' identity cannot be answered simply by referring to its citizens. It is also necessary to take the Israeli law of return into consideration. Israeli sovereignty implies a guarantee to protect the life and liberty of Jews and their families globally. That is why after 1948, the anti-Semitic question of how can we harm our Jewish enemy in the most striking, most destructive, and most acceptable way found this response: by finding strategies and forms of action to deny, undermine, and directly attack Israeli sovereignty. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism on a global level. In the anti-Zionism is the materialization of anti-Semitism as an international movement. And according to Hannah Arendt, that is what it was supposed to be from the very beginning. Footnote. See Hannah Arendt's article Antisemitismus und Faschistische Internationale. I guess that's Anti-Semitism and the Fascist International. End footnote. It uses all the instruments at its disposal on an international level with the goal of destroying Jewish sovereignty and ultimately Jewish existence itself. From this perspective, we are able to understand that anti-Zionism is a new form of Judeophobia, only in the sense that what stands between the Jew haters and their enemy, the Jew, has changed. In other words, while the transition from anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism signals a particular change in the socio-historical determination of the form, or as Hegel puts it, the form Bestimmung of anti-Judaism, it is not the object of Jew hatred that has changed. Footnote. In fact, the final goal of every historical form of anti-Judaism has never changed. Despite all the transformations, rationalizations, and justifications, the ultimate aim of all forms of anti-Judaism is the physical harm and annihilation of specific persons designated as Jewish, whether they actually are or not. End footnote. Israel is merely the new obstacle that stands between Judeophobes and the fulfillment of their unsubstantiated hatred against the Jews. Moreover, the change in form, Hegel's Formwandel, in question here is a rather minor one compared with the transformation of Christian anti-Judaism into what we now call anti-Semitism. Footnote. And we generally do not have Marr and his strategy in mind when we refer to the concept of modern anti-Semitism. End footnote. Modern anti-Semitism emerged with the ground-shaking social changes that accompanied the development of the capitalist mode of production. It was at this particular historical stage when anti-Semitism became systematic, as sociologist Detlef Clausen has pointed out, that it became a method of explaining all the abstract and frightening phenomena of society, and therefore truly a religion of everyday life. Quote, it was only bourgeois society that developed into the anti-Semitic society par excellence, end quote. Detlef Clausen. Anti-Zionism, by contrast, did not emerge in the wake of a comparable fundamental global change. Rather, the anti-Zionist form of Jew hatred arose in response to the more recent emancipation of Jews as citizens of a Jewish state equal among other states. And it is only in reference to the historical Jewish critics of Jewish emancipation that it makes any sense to label contemporary anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic anti-Zionism in order to differentiate between Jewish anti-Zionism before the Shoah and the global anti-Semitic anti-Zionism observed since the foundation of the State of Israel and especially since the Six-Day War. While historical anti-Zionism stood for a specific perspective on how best to achieve Jewish emancipation, and moreover the universal emancipation of all humans, contemporary anti-Zionism aims to destroy the Jewish state, and along with it the successful Jewish emancipation that has enabled Jews to defend themselves, socially, politically, and militarily, against anti-Semitism within and beyond Israel. Footnote. The argument that not everyone who considers him or herself an anti-Zionist has the goal of destroying the state of Israel is merely criticizing a certain policy is unconvincing. People who argue against Israel as a Jewish state in favor of a one-state solution are at the very least ignoring the destructive force of anti-Semitism and therefore opting for a development that would leave Jews defenseless. Further, criticism of the policy of a certain state or government does not imply the necessity to constitute one's own political identity in negation of this specific policy. In fact, it would be difficult to find a comparable terminological construction without regard to ideological movements of global significance. Anti-fascism, anti-communism, etc. and the perceived global significance of Judaism, no matter how large its contribution to civilization may be in reality, has all too often been dominated by the hallucination of the power and influence of, quote, the Jews. Today's concept of anti-Zionism is founded on that delusion. Let me copy that down. End footnote. Anti-Zionism should therefore be considered a new form of anti-Jewish action rather than a new form of Judeophobia. Anti-Zionism as anti-Jewish action. New section. In the last 10 years, the so-called one-state solution has gained much ground within the anti-Zionist movement. Footnote. Among the more prominent attempts to promote it was the Palestine Solidarity Conference, titled Separated in the Past, Together in the Future, that took place in Stuttgart, Germany in November 2010. The more than 200 participants included scholars such as Ilan Pappé, Haider Eid from Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, Mazin Koumsieh from Bezrait University in Ramallah, the prominent German international law professor Norman Paish, activists such as Electronic Intifada founder Ali Abu Nima, journalists and politicians. The final declaration of the conference states that Israel is a racist state that treats Israeli Palestinians like second-class citizens and denies Palestinian refugees internationally acknowledged right to return. It calls for the creation of a, quote, common, secular, and democratic state on the terrain of historical Palestine, end quote, which naturally, quote, includes the displaced Palestinians, end quote. See the Stuttgart Declaration, closing document of the Palestine Solidarity Conference, quote, separated in the past, together in the future, end quote. The conference was followed by another three-day conference under the abbreviated title, One Democratic State. It took place in May 2013 and was broadcast live by the TV station Al Jazeera being the state media of a monarchy. According to the organizers, more than 300 people attended the event. Palästina Committee, Stuttgart, ein demokratischer Staat. End footnote. End footnote. Arguments in favor of a binational state where Palestinians and Jews would live together in a, quote, shared and secular democratic state, end quote, usually insinuate that Israel as a Jewish state is not democratic, which basically means that Palestinian Israeli citizens are not granted the same rights as Jewish Israeli citizens. I'm not sure, but there's I'm pretty sure there's Arab, and not just Arab, but anti-Zionist parties in the Knesset. And I think that one of the Supreme Court justices, I don't know what the actual term is in Israel, is a Muslim Arab. Contrary to that claim, the Israeli Basic Law on Human Dignity states that the state of Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Nonetheless, self-proclaimed anti-Zionists in favor of a one-state solution remind their audience that prior to the foundation of the State of Israel, Jewish intellectuals such as Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber argued in favor of some form of democratic binational solution to the conflict. between Palestinians and the Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. Footnote. For more on those in favor of a two-state solution, see Edward Said, The One-State Solution. I don't know if it's supposed. I think there might be a typo there. It says, for more of those in favor of a two-state solution. It's probably one. I think it's supposed to say one-state solution. I'm not sure, though. For more on Buber's proposition for a binational state, see Martin Buber, A Land of Two Peoples, Martin Buber on Jews and Arabs. Edited by Paul Mendes Floor, 2005. While this is true, end footnote, while this is true, these anti-Zionists usually ignore the fact that neither Buber nor Arendt consider themselves to be anti-Zionist. In fact, Buber was a passionate Zionist, and despite all her criticism, Arendt stayed close to the Zionist movement throughout her life as well. Thus, even though it may sound like a contradictio in adjectio to the anti-Zionists, the concept of Zionism and the argument for a binational state, however critical towards the latter one may be, have been, at least for some Zionists, just as reconcilable historically as is the reality of the state of Israel as a Jewish and at the same time a democratic state today. Hannah Arendt's pro-Zionist perspective led her to argue against Jewish sovereignty in May 1948 because she thought it would threaten the goal of a Jewish homeland, endanger the lives of Palestinians and Jews, and therefore ultimately leave, quote, the unique possibilities and the unique achievements of Zionism in Palestine destroyed, end quote. Arendt. Footnote. The article was published just days before the Israeli Declaration of Independence. See Hannah Arendt, To Save the Jewish Homeland, There is Still Time. End footnote. Apart from her general criticism of the concept of sovereignty, she was concerned above all that a sovereign Jewish state would not be capable of defending itself and its citizens. Thus she warned of the, quote, pseudo-sovereignty of a Jewish state, end quote. In that question she was right. I mean, at least to my understanding of the history, the UN gave the go-ahead for a two-state partition, and that Israel was immediately attacked, and it would not have survived unless it was able to get weapons from Czechoslovakia. And that's the thing about, in reference to that UN discussion of the UN that I just read a second ago. That's the thing, is that the UN did nothing. To my understanding, the UN more or less did nothing when 5 states tried to wipe Israel off the map, smother it in its crib. The only way that Israel was only able to exist as a state because it successfully defended itself. So what I'm getting from this last paragraph is that for Arendt it was more of a pragmatic question than a some kind of essential question. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not a Hannah Arendt expert. In contrast, the anti-Zionist perspective focuses not on the lack, but on the full effect of Jewish sovereignty, which has rendered the state of Israel fully capable of self-defense. To deny the importance of Jewish sovereignty and ultimately destroy its very existence, anti-Zionists pretend to make the case for universalism and democracy and label Israel an obsolete relic built on outmoded political concepts such as the nation-state and national sovereignty. This view is represented by Richard Falk at the Second Palestine Solidarity Conference in Stuttgart. I'm not sure if this is the right person, but it seems like he's referring to Richard Anderson Falk, born 1930. He was an American professor emeritus of international law at Princeton University and Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor's chairman of the Board of Trustees. In 2004, he was listed as the author or co-author of 20 books and the editor or co-editor of another 20 volumes. Falk has published extensively with multiple books written about international law in the United States. In 2008, the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC, appointed Falk to a six-year term as a United Nations Special Reporter on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Back to the text. This view was represented by Richard Falk at the Second Palestine Solidarity Conference in Stuttgart in May 2013 under the title "Working for One Secular Democratic State for All Its Citizens." Falk, professor emeritus for international law at Princeton University and former United Nations special reporter in the disputed territories, argued that, quote, the idea of an ethnic Palestinian state right next to a Jewish state is not reconcilable with the contemporary affirmation of human rights, the dignity of the individual, and the equality of all human beings. In the light of such fundamental ethical and political concepts, by a legitimate form of government, notions of a Jewish state and a Palestinian state in the 21st century not only seem unfavorable, but a serious violation of the rights of all that are living there, end quote. There's a footnote that I missed. Footnote. Arendt argues in favor of a federated state, referring to a proposition made by Judah Magnus that would allow one to, quote, avoid the troublesome majority-minority constellation, end quote, by transferring decision-making and conflict solution largely to, quote, Jewish-Arab community councils, end quote. Parenthesis, Arendt had always been sympathetic to the idea of council democracy, end parenthesis. In 1948, these ideas of a common state did not sound any less idealistic than they do today, and Hannah Arendt was well aware that this was merely wishful thinking. She knew that her ideas would find no sympathy among the majority of Jews or the Arabs, the national movements of the latter taking on a, quote, increasingly fascist coloration, end quote, according to her. The leader, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, organized Bosnian SS divisions and lived in Nazi Germany in Berlin until 1945, I believe. Thereby dismissing any realization of a federated state in the near future, she still called for refraining from declaring a Jewish state. A Jewish state, she argued, quote, at this moment and under present conditions, can only be erected at the price of a Jewish homeland, end quote. Arendt. Clearly, Arendt's concern was a genuinely Zionist concern. Not only does she point out that the declaration of a Jewish state would require its people to live in a constant state of belligerence with disastrous effects on society, but more importantly, in, quote, the light of political, military, and geographic realities, end quote. She also presumed that such a state would face military force from its enemies on a level that would ultimately be too much for the newly founded state to endure. In her albeit very critical understanding of the concept of sovereignty, Arendt was well aware that the latter is defined and proven primarily through external relations and the capability of the sovereign state to defend itself against external enemies. And because her assessment of his capability, where am I? Arendt was well aware that the latter is defined and proven primarily through external relations. Where the fuck did I stop? Sorry, I got spaced out for a second. Not only does she point out that the declaration of a Jewish state would require its people to live in constant state of belligerence with disastrous effects on society, but more importantly, in, quote, the light of political, military, and geographic realities, she also presumed that such a state would face military force from its enemies on a level that would ultimately be too much for the newly found state to endure. In her albeit very critical understanding of the concept of sovereignty, Arendt was well aware that the latter is defined and proven primarily through external relations and the capability of the sovereign state to defend itself against external enemies. And because her assessment of this capability of a prospective Jewish state was a negative one, she considered its sovereignty only, quote, pseudo-sovereignty, end quote. A defenseless Jewish state would ultimately destroy the Zionist achievement of a, quote, Jewish homeland, end quote, in Palestine, while the cost of a more or less constant state of belligerence that Israeli society is forced to bear is indeed substantial in various ways. Arendt has been fortunately proven wrong concerning its defensive capabilities. All quotes from Arendt from the article To Save the Jewish Homeland. End footnote. According to Falk, Jewish sovereignty should be dismissed in the name of human rights, equality, and the dignity of the individual. But not a word was said from this supposed expert on the situation in Palestine about the lethal threat of anti-Semitism to Israel's Jews. Footnote. Falk, Said, and others with their vision of a one-state solution could have learned a lot from Hannah Arendt and her perspective on the future of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. With her pessimistic outlook on the future, she saw the elimination, quote, of all terrorist groups, end quote, as an, quote, axiomatic, end quote, criterion for any exit from the status quo. Speaking of terrorist groups, she of course had Jewish groups in mind when calling for, quote, swift punishment of all terrorist deeds and not merely protests against them, end quote, stating that only these decisive measures will be the, quote, valid proof that the Jewish people in Palestine has recovered its sense of political reality, end quote. Arendt. What Arendt wrote with regard to Irgun, Lehi, and others in 1948 can and must be applied to Palestinian terror today. The, quote, elimination of all terrorist groups and not agreements with them, end quote, as in the case of Hamas with its anti-Semitic agenda, should be considered as the minimum requirement to exit from the present status quo. Only this, one might add, would be valid proof that the Palestinian people have recovered some sense of political reality and are no longer blinded by anti-Semitic rants and delusions. All quotes from Arendt's article, To Save the Jewish Homeland. The case Falk opened against Israel can be radicalized in any way desired and can be observed in various contributions to the same conference. Joseph Massad, professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at New York's Columbia University, for example, suggested that Zionism fully espouses all the ideas of, quote, Marr's anti-Semitic program, end quote. Footnote. See Joseph A. Massad's The Last of the Semites, speech of Joseph A. Massad at the Second Palestine Solidarity Conference. End footnote. According to Massad, Zionism supports the anti-Semitic assertion that, quote, Jews did not fit in the new national configurations and disrupted national and racial purity essential to most European nationalisms, end quote. And therefore Zionism itself is inherently racist and anti-Semitic. God, that's a stupid argument. However, most European Jews, as Massad explained further, saw through this. That is why they stayed in Europe and exposed themselves to the lethal threat of Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic policy. Quote, while the majority of Jews continued to resist the anti-Semitic basis of Zionism and its alliances with anti-Semites, end quote, Massad declared, quote, the Nazi genocide not only killed 90% of European Jews, but in the process also killed the majority of Jewish enemies of Zionism, who died precisely because they refused to heed the Zionist call of abandoning their countries and homes, end quote. Jesus Christ. Not only does Massad add a new version of the libel about a full-fledged collaboration of Nazis and Zionists prior to the Shoah, but he also implies that the Shoah played well into the hands of the Zionists as the Nazis helped them get rid of their, quote, Jewish enemies, end quote, when the, quote, Holocaust killed off the majority of Jews who fought and struggled against European anti-Semitism, including Zionism, end quote. That's fucking insane. And that quote is from Massad's book, Last of the Semites. It's funny how it's funny how in the United States, people who literally like collaborated with like the KKK or like in like the anti-racist, in like the Black freedom struggle, are celebrated as like heroes, despite this. Whereas like whereas like to my understanding is that Zionists helped people immigrate out of Nazi Germany, which when you immigrated from Nazi Germany, that meant involving yourself with the Nazi German state, because it was the state. It wasn't just something you could like maybe or maybe not involve yourself with when you're trying to emigrate. One of the big things, the reason that people didn't stay or didn't leave Nazi Germany in as great as numbers as they could, or other places in Europe, is because once the Nazis were in power, getting through the red tape and all of the paperwork together in order to immigrate, including all I think there was pretty like they demanded that you leave like a pretty substantial quantity of your wealth in the country. To refer to that as like Nazi collaboration is like quite disgusting. But the other thing that I think I just had another thought. But like other people, say for instance, like I'm pretty sure that like I'm not an expert on it, but I'm pretty sure like the Nation of Islam like had like Nazis like I can't remember his name. I think it's something Rockwell, George Rockwell. I can't remember his name, but like the leader of the American Nazi Party like speak at some of their like events in Detroit, talking about like the incompatibility between the white and the black races, and the same thing with Marcus Garvey trying to collaborate and was not forced to by any means. Let's be clear, was not forced to do this. Collaborate with the KKK. For its the Back to Africa movement. Both of those people, Farrakhan, for instance, the Nation of Islam is viewed with somewhat more skepticism by certain quarters, but not nearly enough. But Marcus Garvey is put up there with like Martin Luther King And there's kind of like almost this like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin kind of thing in the United States, where it's like you know, fucking, it'll have like anyone who ever said anything against white supremacy in the United States, like that was black, like put like right up next to each other, as if there wasn't like very very serious distinctions to be made between any of these people. Like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X were not Martin Luther King. They might have all been opposed to white supremacy, but not all of them were opposed to racism as full stop. Martin Luther King was. And it's not just a whitewashing of King. Martin Luther King did have very radical opinions, but they were fundamentally, I mean, I'm not an expert, to my understanding, fundamentally steeped in like agape and universalism and like seeking a benevolent community between people, which is definitely not what Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey thought for the majority of their careers. Let's like not, it's crazy though how like people literally fleeing from a state to another place to find refuge from a state that is openly saying we're going to like very very virulently anti-Semitic. And it might not have been clear that the final solution was going to happen, when it was finally declared. So in 1941, obviously, Jewish persecution of Jews was already in full swing prior to 1941, obviously. But like in the double standard there's a very extreme double standard. The Nazi collaboration, Zionist collaboration with Nazism, but people like Marcus Garvey or the Nation of Islam being celebrated as freedom fighters. The double standard doesn't seem to connect with anyone. Just some thoughts, thinking to myself out loud. Where am I? The consequences that anti-Zionism draws from all this are evident. Supporting the existence of Jewish sovereignty means supporting, quote, Nazi pro-Zionism, end quote. End quote. Zionism's anti-Semitic program of assimilating Jews into whiteness in a colonial settler state, end quote, is, in short, quote, a direct continuation of anti-Semitic policies prevalent before the war, end quote, and is now, of course, quote, directed at Arabs and Muslims, end quote. Mossad. By contrast, according to this perfidious logic, fighting against Israel is fighting against Nazism, anti-Semitism, colonialism, and anti-Muslim racism, all at the same time. Or, as another speaker put it in his account of the conference, if one really wants to invoke, quote, anti-fascist values and lessons drawn from the crimes of the Nazis as condensed in universal human rights, one had to fight against Zionist colonialism, end quote. Footnote. Wilhelm Langthaler, Deutsche Staatswesen gegen Demokratie, 2013. The author, Wilhelm Langthaler, goes on to quote historian Ilan Pape, according to whom the two-state solution was a, quote, purely Zionist invention, end quote, anyway, to, quote, sell the 19th century colonial principles in the 21st century to a world longing for democracy and that had bitter experiences with nationalism in the 20th century, end quote. End footnote. Statements like these show how anti-Zionists aim to transform elements of postmodern discourse, such as post-national universalism and post-colonial anti-racism, into a postmodern anti-Jewish action strategy in order to attain acceptance and attract followers. But in search for such a strategy, why has the one-state solution only recently gained such popularity? The answer is provided by John Reese, co-founder of the Stop the War Coalition. In a July 2014 article For the journal Counterfire, Rees asks, quote, what strategy can bring the Palestinians victory, end quote. And informs us that, quote, the rise of the two-state solution was in part a result of the decay of Arab nationalism, end quote. Once the, quote, heroic phase of Arab nationalist resistance to European colonialism, end quote, lay in the past and had become a quagmire of neoliberalism and corruption, quote, another force, bracket, political Islam, and bracket, arose, end quote, and displaced, quote, Arab nationalism as a vehicle for anti-imperialist sentiment in the Middle East. ... Its primary appeal has been its relative willingness to fight imperialism just at the moment when the previous generation of Arab nationalists were colluding with it, end quote. John Rees. Rees's assessment of this newfound force is crystal clear. Quote, all this returns us to the possibility of a one-state solution, a single democratic multi-faith state running from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, end quote, governed by the, quote, Palestinians and others that live within the borders of historic Palestine. So the Islamists are going to achieve this. The Islamists are going to achieve the one secular state. As if the actually existing Arab nationalism had some actual serious democratic content to it. As if the states of, say, for instance, the Ba'athist states or Nasser's Egypt were some type of step forward on either democratic or socialist grounds. They might have had certain anti-capitalist qualities, but someone, John Rees, like John Rees should know better that anti-capitalism is not synonymous with socialism. From any meaningful conception of what socialism meant in Marx or in others. Anyway, at least some of the attendees of the Stuttgart conference hold views similar to these. They vehemently advocate drawing closer to political Islam and even actively invite Islamists to join forces with them. At the same time, these anti-Zionists are supposedly in favor of a, quote, secular democratic state, end quote. They reveal that their claims for secularism are just a bluff when they demand that their fellow combatants dispense with the, quote, epithet, quote, secular, end quote, end quote. Wilhelm Langthaler. Even while many Islamists stand in favor of democracy, as Wilhelm Langthaler assumes, quote, secularism remains a boogeyman to them, end quote. What the anti-Zionists are denying is that a Jewish sovereign state exists and must exist. This denial is part of a strategy seeking to deprive the Jewish people of the only sovereign force uncompromisingly ready to defend Jews worldwide against anti-Semitism and the forces of political Islam, the same forces John Rees and his kind promote as a model for their, quote, democratic, end quote, but hardly secular solution. And secularism would be a fundamental part of that solution. Like a secularism would be an inherent part of democracy. Although the promotion of a one-state solution may be regarded as a rather propagandistic aspect of contemporary forms of anti-Jewish action, not least because it is designed to attract new followers, attempts to use international law as a weapon against Israel are among the more practical efforts to take action against Jewish sovereignty. So-called lawfare against Israel does not merely attempt to delegitimize the Jewish state in the public perception. As Jeremy Rabkin clearly defines it, lawfare is a, quote, strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve military objectives. End quote. Jeremy Rabkin. The anti-Zionist movement has clearly understood that international law, in cases where it has a binding impact, can actually undermine the sovereignty of a state. It's interesting that one of the things that I thought was, and I'm not an expert on like what constitutes like a republic. What is the extent of what a republic can be until it's no longer a republic. But one of the things, to my understanding, or to my memory of like philosophy classes about Kant, and the kind of his view of like a cosmopolitan world order, kind of like a world government, is one of the preconditions for that world government, which is like kind of where the UN takes its inspiration from Kant's perspective, is the requirement that all states participating in that international body be republics. I'm not exactly sure what the minimum level of democracy for a republic must be, but like the fact that the UN is full of like deeply authoritarian, anti-democratic states, undermines the effectiveness of what the UN was set out to be. Back to the text. There is, of course, an ongoing discussion in political theory regarding whether the concept of sovereignty really implies that a state is responsible to no one and not bound by international and humanitarian law. But the fact is that international law is a negotiated set of rules that results from power relations and not from a supreme political body equipped with the executive authorities of a state. Thus, when a sovereign nation state can be forced from the outside to comply with international law or an international set of rules, instead of doing so of its free general will, its sovereignty is effectively diminished. And trying to impose this force on Israel as part of the strategy of BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, and the initiatives attempting to drag Israel before the International Criminal Court. Clearly, the reason for the Palestinian Authority's decision to sign the Rome Statute and to submit itself to the jurisdiction of the ICC was not to strengthen the rule of law in Israel or a future Palestine. Matzen Masri is a lecturer at SOAS. Nothing particularly interesting. As Mazen Masri of London City's Law School puts it, despite, quote, its characterization as a court, the ICC is essentially a political institution, and international criminal justice is essentially a contested political framework, end quote. Matzen Masri. However, he adds, quote, international law is part of the fabric of international relations, and to ignore it would be to forfeit a potentially useful tool, end quote. Matsri's colleague, Nora Erakat, a professor at George Mason University, elaborates on how this tool can be used most effectively. Quote, the challenge ahead is to innovate not simply litigation strategies, but to put them in conversation with radical popular mobilization, end quote. As a part of this radical mobilization, she envisions, quote, primarily but not exclusively the global BDS campaign, end quote, as well as Hamas. Footnote. See Noura Erakat, who is afraid of the International Criminal Court. Wait, hold on, no. Wrong one. Middle East Research and Information Project. The latter she hopes to see in, quote, a more realistic unity government, one that envisions the possibility of international criminal court prosecution against Palestinian groups and prepares for the attendant fallout, end quote. Erakat advises the Palestinian Authority to limit its engagement with the International Criminal Court to the question of settlements to minimize the risks of Palestine itself being prosecuted, quote, for suicide bombings launched from the West Bank and other alleged crimes under the Rome Statute, end quote. Noura Erakat, who is afraid of the International Criminal Court. AI Overview says, or Wikipedia says, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is the treaty that established the International Criminal Court. It was adopted at a diplomatic conference in Rome in Italy on the 17th of July, 1998, and it entered into force on the 1st of July, 2002. As of January 2025, 125 states are party to the Institute. Among other things, it establishes court function, jurisdiction, and structure. The Rome Statute established four international crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Those crimes, quote, shall not be subject to any statute of limitations, end quote. Under the Rome Statute, the ICC can only investigate and prosecute the four core international crimes in situations where states are quote, unable or, quote, unwilling to do so themselves. The jurisdiction of the court is complementary to jurisdictions of domestic courts. The court has jurisdiction over crimes only if they are committed in the territory of, by a national of, or on a vessel registered under a state party or a non-party that has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, or if the United States Security Council makes a referral. The provision on the crime of aggression did not take effect until after it was defined at the 2010 Kampala Conference. The Rome Statute established four core international crimes: 1. Genocide, 2. Crimes against humanity, 3. War crimes, 4. Crimes of aggression. Following years of negotiation aimed at establishing a permanent international tribunal to prosecute individuals accused of genocide and other serious international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression, The United Nations General Assembly convened a 5-week diplomatic conference in Rome in June 1998, quote, to finalize and adopt a convention on the establishment of an international criminal court, end quote. Back to the text. The strategy of using international law as a battering ram against Israeli sovereignty includes creating, quote, innovative claims within the International Court of Justice, ICJ, as well as foreign national courts, end quote, while protecting Islamist terrorist groups from being prosecuted. As Erekat points out, it has been a wise decision for the Palestinian leadership not to refer any specific situation or case to the Office of the Prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. According to her, the main benefit that one can hope to extract from the ICC is deterring Israel from using reasonable military force in any future conflict in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, that is, as a tool to undermine Israel's self-defense capabilities. Having come to no legal conclusion, the ICC is still involved in the aftermath of the so-called Gaza Freedom Flotilla. It is probably the most interesting example of anti-Jewish action because it includes both direct action and lawfare against Israel. The Freedom Flotilla sailed in May 2010 and consisted of 6 ships, including the passenger vessel Mavi Marmara that served as the flagship of the convoy. According to official claims by the organizers, the flotilla was supposed to carry humanitarian aid and construction material to Gaza on the in May 2010. However, the main groups behind the flotilla, the Free Gaza Movement and the Turkish Foundation for Human Rights and Freedoms and Humanitarian Relief, deliberately planned to break the Israeli-Egyptian blockade of the Gaza Strip, refusing the Israeli offer to check the cargo in Ashdod Harbor and deliver the goods, including materials banned for import such as cement, to Gaza via land. This refusal underlines that the purpose of the flotilla was not humanitarian but political, and its aim was to directly violate Israeli sovereignty. Adam Shapiro, one of the board members of the Free Gaza movement, summed up its goals. Quote, Free Gaza is but one tactic of a larger strategy to transform this conflict from one between Israel and the Palestinians into one between the rest of the world and Israel. End quote. Adam Shapiro. Footnote. See the article by Melanie Phillips titled The Flotilla and the Third Intifada. End footnote. Wikipedia says Adam Shapiro, born 1972, is an American co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, a pro-Palestine organization, the stated mission of which is to bring civilians from around the world to resist non-violently the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. He became famous for visiting Yasser Arafat in his Muqata government palace in Ramallah while it was besieged during the March 2002 Israeli military operation in the West Bank and Gaza. Free Gaza movement. According to Wikipedia, the Free Gaza movement, FGM, is a coalition of human rights activists and pro-Palestinian groups formed to break Egypt and Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip and publicize the situation of the Palestinians there. Free Gaza movement has challenged the Israeli-Egyptian blockade by sailing humanitarian aid ships to Gaza. The group has more than 70 endorsers, including elite Desmond Tutu and Noam Chomsky. The organizations participating in the Free Gaza movement include the International Solidarity Movement. The activists participating in the effort include Jeff Halper, Hetty Epstein, Lauren Booth, and members of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim religious organizations. Israeli intelligence agencies claim that it also includes Islamist organizations that pose a security threat to Israel. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and Canada all publicly opposed the 2011 flotilla. And let's look up the Turkish Foundation for Human Rights and Freedoms and Humanitarian Relief. IHH Humanitarian Relief Foundation, in English, the Foundation for Human Rights and Freedoms and Humanitarian Relief, or IHH, is a conservative Turkish NGO active in more than 120 countries. Established in 1992 and officially registered in Istanbul in 1995, the IHH provides humanitarian relief of areas of war, earthquake, hunger, and conflict. The IHH holds special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council since 2004. Current president of the IHH is Femi Bülent Yildirim. In 2015, IHH notably campaigned to turn the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. IHH is also active in SAR, search and rescue operations, hosting around 850 volunteer search and rescue trained personnel. IHH has multiple SAR teams stationed in different cities of Turkey, ready for action at all times. IHH was owner and operator of 3 flotilla ships involved in the convoy intended to breach the blockade of Gaza in 2010. These ships included the MV Mavi Marmara, a passenger vessel that served as the flagship of the convoy. 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara, many of them members of the IHH, were killed by the Israeli military during the Gaza flotilla raid. The IHH, through its collaboration with Turkish intelligence, Erdogan's Turkey, sometimes acts as an international intermediary between the National Intelligence Organization and the Syrian rebels. A sister organization, IHH Germany, has been banned in Germany. The IHH is said to be connected to directly involved in weapons trafficking in Libya, India, and to Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations such as Nusra Front in Syria. The IHH has been accused by the chief of French counterterrorism unit of having ties to Islamist organizations such as Al-Qaeda. IHH was accused in a bipartisan bill of Congress of being a member of the Union of Good, a group known for funneling money to terrorist organizations. The IHH has close links to the Turkish government and specifically with the ruling Turkish party AKP under Turkish President Erdogan. The New York Times reported that IHH assisted Erdogan in the 2010 elections. IHH receives funding from the Qatari Aid Charity. Some fucking human rights foundation. The anti-Zionist movement is clearly engaged in actions that constitute attempts to maneuver Israel into a lose-lose situation. Either it accepts the impingement on its sovereignty or it risks international isolation. Furthermore, the Gaza flotilla was characterized by a specific division of labor. On the one hand, Israeli sovereignty was directly tested by the flotilla's attempt to break through Israel's, quote, naval blockade, end quote, and by Islamist hardcore activists physically attacking Israel Defense Force officers. On the one hand, so-called human rights activists such as two members of the German federal parliament, Annette Groth and Inge Hüger, as well as the popular German international scholar Norman Paisch, also from Die Linke, presenting themselves as more moderate and respectable, tried to maximize the anti-Israeli fallout in the media, in international relations, and with regard to international law. Footnote: when the flotilla's 6 civilian ships were stopped en route to Gaza while still in international waters on the 31st of May 2010, 7 IDF soldiers were injured in the clash that ensued on one of them, the Mavi Marmara, and 9 activists of the Turkish Foundation for the Human Rights and Freedoms and Humanitarian Relief were killed. The activists attacked the IDF commandos and with, at a minimum, metal pipes and bats as they came down from the helicopter. Videos show activists beating one of the soldiers and trying to kidnap him. End footnote. Conclusion. The changes we are observing in the expression of Jew hatred are not only the result of social changes reflected in an unconscious process of anti-Semitic projections. They are also based on the haters' need, through new forms of anti-Jewish action, to adequately respond to socio-historical changes, above all the creation of the State of Israel, insofar as they affect the anti-Semitic worldview. The contemporary anti-Jewish mindset and form of action we know as anti-Zionism allows for the global unification of Jew haters based on their common enemy. Whereas Wilhelm Marr opposed the Jews in the name of humanism, the anti-Zionists oppose Israel in the name of universalism that is no less toxic than Marr's humanism, which itself paved the way for the race theorists to exclude the Jews from the human race. This is perfectly illustrated by the understanding of universalism proposed by Alain Badiou. As Shira Wolosky explains, for Badiou, the, quote, figure of the Jew emerges as the very essence of particularism, the betrayer of saving universalism, end quote. Wolosky. Badiou's universalism is an empty and destructive one without any room for the Jews. Its aim is to erase every distinction. Badiou's philosophical concept of universalism is one in which even the words that allow for distinction have to be erased. Footnote. For more on Badiou's universalism, see Wolosky, Badiou, Paul in Telos 52. As Wolosky states, Badiou's concept of universalism opposes any social order as oppressive, and as such, it is perfectly compatible with hatred against civilization, and thus with what can be considered the core of the anti-Semitic delusion. And footnote. But if the Jew is the essence of particularism, it is the universalist anti-Semite who intuitively understands that what this requires on a practical level. In contrast, Theodor W. Adorno, whose thinking aimed at the prospect of allowing difference without fear, knew that only a concept of universalism that is able to reconcile the individual, the particular, and the universal deserves to be called universalism. Quote, the totality of the universal expresses its own failure. What tolerates nothing particular is thus revealing itself as particularly dominant. The general reason that comes to prevail is already a restricted reason. End quote. Adorno. Negative dialectics. Thus, anti-Zionist universalism is an anti-Semitic universalism, because it sees the Jewish state and the Jews as outdated forms of particularism, preventing universalism from its fulfillment, just as Marr had felt that the Jews had prevented human emancipation. Anti-Zionists are, as Vladimir Yankelevich wrote, anti-Semites in the name of democracy. Wikipedia says Vladimir Yankelevich lived from 1903 to 1985 and was a French philosopher and musicologist. Back to the text. While Marr's primary goal was to isolate German Jews on the social stage even after their emancipation, today's anti-Zionists are attempting to isolate Israel on the international stage through all forms of boycott, cultural, academic, and economic. At the same time, they are working to curtail and finally destroy Israeli sovereignty. Ultimately, all anti-Jewish action represents an attempt to attain a consistent goal: the destruction of the legal, political, and social institutions that serve as guarantors of contemporary Jewry in all its forms. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.